600 autonomous machines crossed into the most protected airspace on the planet in a single night. Not one at a time. All of them, simultaneously. That is not a military statistic. That is a declaration. The world's media will show you the fires, the smoke, the airport closures, the diplomatic statements. What they will not show you is the structural logic underneath. The reason this night was not an escalation of the same war, but the opening of an entirely different one. There is a mechanism at work here that most coverage completely misses. And once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. Here is the question you should be asking yourself. If the most protected capital in Europe, ringed by layered missile batteries, electronic warfare systems, and decades of Soviet-era air defense doctrine, could not stop 600 cheap unmanned vehicles in a single night, what does that tell you about every assumption this conflict has been built on? Let us start with one number, 11%. That is the share of Russia's total oil refining capacity already removed from service before this night, the result of a sustained Ukrainian drone campaign across 2024 and 2025. According to production data from that period, output had already fallen by roughly 460,000 barrels per day, with operational damage confirmed at 16 separate facilities. That number, 11%, means that before a single vehicle crossed into Moscow's airspace, Russia's industrial war machine was already bleeding from the arteries. The mainstream media narrative of a grinding stalemate ignores this entirely, because acknowledging it destroys the idea that Russia's rear is secure, that its production lines are humming, that time is on its side. Now let us go back further to understand how we arrived at that night. Throughout 2024, Ukrainian strike operations against Russian energy infrastructure began as isolated, individually planned attacks. Single facilities, single nights. The results were significant but containable. Russia could absorb one refinery fire. It could repair one pipeline station. The narrative held, the war was at the front, in the trenches, in the mud of Donetsk. Moscow was elsewhere. Moscow was safe. By early 2025, the pattern shifted. Attacks became more coordinated. Multiple targets in the same operational window. The doctrine was evolving, but slowly enough that the Kremlin could still manage the information. State television kept broadcasting. The airports stayed open. The sirens were not needed. Then came the night of May 17, 2026. The operation began from multiple directions simultaneously, south, southwest, and west, specifically engineered to arrive at the edge of Moscow's radar coverage at the same moment. This was not a coincidence of timing. It was the entire point. Every modern air defense battery, whether an S-400, a Panzer S-1, or a Tor system, has a finite number of simultaneous engagement channels. There is a ceiling. You can only lock onto and fire at so many targets at once, regardless of how expensive or sophisticated your equipment is. What Ukrainian planners understood, and what that night demonstrated at operational scale, is that this ceiling can be mathematically overwhelmed. Flood the engagement channels with enough simultaneous targets, and the laws of arithmetic do the rest. The expensive guided munitions, the ones carrying real destructive payloads, travel behind the wave. They reach their objectives not because the defenses failed technically, but because the defenses were already full. That is an elegant idea, and it is now proven doctrine. Think of it this way. Imagine a toll booth on a motorway, one with 3 lanes open. Under normal conditions, it processes traffic efficiently. Now imagine 1,000 vehicles arriving simultaneously from 3 directions at once. The lanes are not broken. The staff has not abandoned their posts. The system is simply saturated. It cannot process faster than its design allows. The cars at the back of the wave and the ones carrying the most valuable cargo roll through not because of any failure of will or technology, but because capacity has a ceiling that math can always exceed. That is what happened over Moscow. The toll booth held. The cargo got through anyway. Now let us look at what the cargo hit, because most reporting treats the targets as a list of names without explaining what those names mean. The first facility that matters is the oil refinery in the Kapotnya district of Moscow itself. This installation had been considered effectively untouchable. Too close to the capital, too heavily protected, too politically consequential to ever be reached. It had survived the entire drone campaign of the previous 2 years without a single confirmed strike. That mythology ended when the first images of the fire reached social media. The significance is not only operational, it is symbolic. If Kapotnya can burn, the concept of an untouchable facility in Russia no longer exists. The second target that demands attention is a fuel loading station northwest of Moscow, connected to the Transneft pipeline network, Russia's central arterial system for petroleum distribution. The station serves as a pressure node for the ring pipeline around the capital, regulating fuel flow to military logistics chains and civilian supplies simultaneously. The large storage tanks that ignited there created not just physical destruction, but a choke point in the supply chain that analysts estimated would require weeks to fully restore. Combined with the pre-existing 11% capacity reduction, this is not damage that can be quietly absorbed. It has consequences that ripple outward to fuel prices, to military logistics, to agricultural machinery, to civilian transport. The third set of targets was perhaps the most strategically consequential of all, and it received the least serious analysis in Western media. The Zelenograd Technology District north of Moscow has been Russia's primary hub for domestic microelectronics development since the Soviet period. Under the weight of Western sanctions, Russia has been forced to develop domestic production of the guidance chips, optical sensors, and electronic control systems that go into its cruise missiles, drone controllers, and precision munitions. The facility struck that night. Research parks and production facilities hosting over 100 sanctioned companies were not making consumer electronics. They were producing the central nervous system of Russia's precision strike capability. Microelectronics manufacturing is extraordinarily sensitive to disruption. Fire, vibration, particulate contamination, any of these can render precision production lines inoperable for months. Under sanctions, sourcing replacement equipment is not a matter of placing an order. It may be a matter of years. And then there was the Design Bureau in the Dubna district, the facility responsible for the engineering and development of cruise missiles that have been striking Ukrainian cities throughout this war. Targeting the Design Bureau is not the same as destroying a warehouse of finished weapons. It is attacking the intellectual infrastructure, the place where next year's weapons are being planned, tested, and refined. You can rebuild a production hall. You cannot as easily rebuild the accumulated institutional knowledge of an engineering team whose workspace has been destroyed and whose continuity has been shattered. Simultaneously, strikes in Crimea targeted air bases and a naval communications hub, and a patrol vessel was hit from over 1,000 kilometers away. The geography of the operation was not accidental. It was a demonstration there is no rear anymore. There is no safe zone. The entire landmass is now within operational range. What this created inside the Russian state apparatus is a dilemma with no clean solution, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment. Russia's military has been deploying its most capable air defense assets forward, near the front lines in Ukraine, because that is where the immediate tactical threat to aircraft and ground forces is greatest. But Moscow is now a demonstrated target. The refineries are demonstrated targets. The technology parks are demonstrated targets. If the Kremlin pulls its most capable systems back to protect the capital and the industrial base, it weakens the front. Ukrainian forces gain tactical breathing room in the trenches. If it does not pull those systems back, Moscow accepts repeated strikes on its economic and symbolic heart. There is no position on this chessboard that is not a concession. Both moves cost something irreplaceable. Meanwhile, the Russian public experienced something the state had been successfully preventing for 4 years. The war arrived at their door without warning, not metaphorically. No sirens sounded in the Moscow region during the attack. No SMS alert system activated. Citizens in the outer districts watched explosions and fires from their windows without any official communication. They flooded emergency lines. The lines were jammed. Local community channels filled with a single repeated question: why is no one warning us? Here is what that silence means. The Russian government made a calculation. If sirens sound across a metropolis of 12 million people in the middle of the night, millions move toward shelters. Chaos, panic, political cost. The choice was made, consciously or institutionally, to absorb the physical damage in silence rather than acknowledge it publicly in real time. That is not a government that believes it is winning. That is a government managing the perception of losing. The silence was not a logistical failure. It was a political confession. In the morning, official statements claimed extraordinary numbers of intercepted vehicles, Figures that climbed through the day into the thousands, numbers that bore no relationship to the visible evidence of burning refineries, damaged airports, and scattered wreckage near passenger terminals. If the interceptions were as complete as claimed, the fires needed an explanation. The fires had no explanation that the official narrative could absorb. So the numbers simply grew larger, hoping volume would substitute for coherence. It did not work. Now project forward. In 2 years, if current trajectory holds, Ukraine's domestic drone production will have scaled to the point where operations like the one on May 17th are not exceptional. They are periodic. The capacity Russia is attempting to defend against is not fixed. It is compounding. Every month that passes without a negotiated end, the asymmetry deepens. Russia faces a force that is getting cheaper to arm and harder to stop, while its own precision production lines have been set back by the targeting of Zelenograd. The economics of this trajectory do not favor the side with the larger conventional military. In 5 years, the lasting damage may not be the physical infrastructure at all. The lasting damage may be the fundamental restructuring of what Russian strategic planners believe is possible. The idea that geographic depth equals strategic safety, the idea that Moscow is insulated from the consequences of wars it initiates beyond its borders, has been operationally disproven. Rebuilding that assumption requires either a genuine negotiated settlement or a security architecture that does not currently exist and cannot be quickly created. In a decade, historians will likely mark this period as the moment when the logic of centralized military power met the logic of distributed, low-cost autonomous systems, and the outcome was not what the 20th century would have predicted. The expensive fortress lost to the cheap swarm, the layered defense lost to arithmetic. The myth of the unreachable capital was retired not in theory, not in a war game, but on a Tuesday night in May. And here's the number I've saved for the end. 600, not the number of vehicles launched. Think about what 600 means in cost terms. Each of these platforms, depending on specification, costs somewhere in the low thousands of dollars. The total cost of the swarm, call it a few million at most, achieved disruption to facilities representing billions in infrastructure, set back missile production by a timeline measured in months, closed the aviation network of a major capital for hours, and delivered a psychological blow to a population that had been told consistently that the war was winning and that home was safe. 600 cheap machines accomplished what no amount of diplomatic pressure had managed in 4 years. That ratio, the cost of the attack against the cost of the damage, is the summary of everything that has changed. The question you have to sit with now is this. In a world where that ratio is real and proven and reproducible, what does a great power's military advantage actually consist of? What does it mean to have the largest defense budget, the most sophisticated layered air defense, the deepest reserves of conventional military hardware, if a few $1 million and the right doctrine can reach the heart of your capital on any given night? The 21st century is not one with the largest arsenal. It is one with the most adaptive doctrine. That is not a hopeful statement or a reassuring one. It is simply what that night proved. Somewhere in Moscow right now, in a government building with its blinds drawn, someone is reading an assessment of how many of these nights the system can absorb. They do not yet have a good answer. That is where this war stands.